all. CJ Burke here with DevelopEV, and today I got a special guest, Eric Sandmann. We're going to talk about everything ADA, and if you have ever built EV charging for public in the public, you'll have definitely experienced ADA, and it can either have been a benefit to your project or it might have been a total pain in the ass, depending on what it put you through. And it's really important that we talk through it because EV charging as a whole, it's really necessary that everyone has access to it, whether you do have a disability or not. So it's stuff that I think has been addressed pretty early on. And I think it's a really important thing that we all need to consider, whether you're developing for the public or for fleet behind the fence. So I got Eric Sandmann here, who is an expert in this. And he's also a really good friend of mine. We have gone back many years. We played volleyball together at Arizona State. We actually played volleyball against each other in high school. So we've known each other for a very, very, very long time. So Eric, do you just want to give a quick intro? And I also always call you Sandman, so it's gonna be hard for me to call you Eric.
Yeah, so my name is Eric Sandmann. I'm a professional engineer. I work for Machin Engineering up in Traverse City, Michigan. I've been an engineer for the past 7 years of my life, and then over the course of those 7 years, I've had a lot of experience working with ADA designs for various projects.
Awesome. So I think what we're going to start off first with is just, for those who don't know, what is ADA and like kind of where did it come from?
Yeah, so the history of ADA, it's pretty vast and extensive. It started back in 1973 when Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act was passed by the U.S. Congress. This act banned discrimination on the basis of disability, and it classified those with disabilities as a minority group. Unfortunately, this act did not define what was considered to be discrimination in the context of disability, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was tasked with implementing regulations associated with Section 503. And then, as with any government agency, this process was drawn out and people began to focus their attention on what the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was doing, and the movement began. On April 5th of 1977, a sit-in was organized in San Francisco at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare building that lasted for 28 days. And this resulted in the department releasing the Section 504 regulations on May 4th of 1977. After this, the battle to continue to protect the disabled community was far from over because during the Reagan administration, a task force on regulatory relief was created under the leadership of then Vice President George H.W. Bush with a mission to deregulate the regulations, and Section 504 regulations came under crossfire of this task force. The news swept across the nation, and over the next 2 years, letters were constantly being sent in by people with disabilities and parents of children who had disabilities, and representatives from the disabled community met with administration officials to explain why deregulation proposal should not be adopted. The disabled community's efforts were successful, and the administration halted their efforts to deregulate Section 504. The disability movement faced more headwinds in the 1980s due to negative Supreme Court rulings that impacted the reach of protection that Section 504 provided. The community continued to lobby and promote awareness of the struggles that they faced, and in April 1988, the first version of the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced into Congress. In September of 1988, a joint hearing was held before the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy and the House Subcommittee on Select Education. Witnesses with a wide variety of disabilities showed up, overflowing a room that was intended to seat just a little over 700 people to testify to the architectural and communication barriers, as well as the stereotyping and prejudice they faced. And after the hearing, a commitment was made by Senator Kennedy, Senator Harkin, and Representative Owens that a comprehensive disability civil rights bill would be top priority for the next Congress, with both presidential candidates, Vice President Bush and Governor Dukakis, endorsing broad civil rights protection for people with disabilities. On May 9th, 1989, a new ADA was introduced to Congress. This bill went to vote on September 7th, 1989, in front of the Senate and passed with a vote of 76-8. The bill moved on to the House of Representatives and underwent hearings by 4 separate committees over the next 3 years, and was finally passed on January 26th, 1992, and went into effect on July 26th of 1992. Now, the ADA requirements have undergone revisions over the years, and the most recently updated version of the ADA regulations was released in September of 2010.
Geez, that was ridiculously extensive. So like, because like I always thought everything just started like maybe in like the couple years in like early '90s, but it actually had something a lot more extensive. And then ever since that date, I guess ever since we've been alive, generally speaking, it's basically been enforced.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Very extensive background and a lot of moving parts and a lot of people involved to, really bring these regulations to the disabled community and to the United States.
Yeah, and I guess this might go without saying, but like generally, like what was like the impetus for this being created? Like, why was this all of a sudden like, because obviously disabled people haven't. It's not like a uniquely new thing, right? Like, why was this all of a sudden, um, you know, late '70s, '80s, early '90s? This became something that we needed to address in the United States.
Yeah, so basically, the disabled community ended up um, encountering barriers that prohibited them from enjoying their everyday life. And this was created to ensure that people with a vast array of disabilities were not forgotten about and were provided access to everyday destinations, such as shops and stores that they had previously not been able to access before. You know, previously there were no regulations for how people could get in. So if someone was in a wheelchair and there was a step entrance into a shop along the street front, they automatically couldn't get into that building because they couldn't get their wheelchair over the step.
Yep, and that's it. It for me, it seems like this should have been something that they've thought of from the beginning, and it's kind of crazy. It took our civilization so long to have this just be something that's kind of code enforced. But it is definitely something that I'm glad we're in a place where we are kind of taking into these considerations so that everyone does have access to facilities and charging infrastructure in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess when it comes to when ADA requirements are triggered, I think a lot of developers were not always kind of, you know, in a position where we're kind of going to a site that's brand new, that we're working with an architect and everything. It's usually we're kind of retrofitting sites, but just kind of in general, when does ADA get triggered for a parking lot?
Yeah, so ADA is always going to be required on parking lots, and it's based on the number of parking spaces that are provided. Um, the regulations have a nice table. Basically, for the first 100, you need to provide one per 25 parking spaces need to be ADA accessible. Um, After that, first 100, it's one per 50, and then as you go on, it starts to become percentages. Um, yeah,
Yep, and I know like California has a good table for EV that it's like very well defined of like how many stalls you're putting in for EV, how many accessible stalls that you need. So that's always been kind of really easy to follow. But I know in some states, especially with for EV charging, it's defined for conventional parking, like convenience store or a Target or a Walgreens or something. When it's for EV, it's sometimes a question mark on like, what standard do you go with, or you just go with what, California did, or maybe some initial guidance that was given out from the federal government, but isn't technically codified in that specific jurisdiction.
yeah. So it's ADA has their federal regulations, so they're the regulations that apply blanketed across the United States. Each state and municipality is allowed to enhance the requirements of ADA parking. So there are some states that do have additional requirements, such as California. New Jersey's another state. Florida does have some additional requirements for parking space and their layouts as well. So you should always check with your state and local regulations, and not just blindly go off of the federal ADA regulations.
Absolutely. I've had multiple projects, and probably you have too, where, what, you kind of just took as gospel from maybe like a state incentive program that was requiring something through like NEVI, but then the AHJ and the plan checker was like, oh, no, 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 you have to do this, this, and this, and it caused like a huge change order and stuff. So it definitely communicate, reach out, and try to get that guidance as early on as possible to help with your project, so you're not getting delays, you're not getting rammed with information down the road that you didn't expect.
Yes, exactly. And if you're having a hard time finding them, I found the best way to get your answers is just pick up the phone and call the municipality, and they're usually happy to work with you.
Absolutely. Like, especially if you're trying to like, accommodate, like you're not calling and saying, hey, I don't want this applied. It's like, hey, I want to do the right thing. What do you want to see out of this? Right. And I think that usually goes a long way, especially when they do see the plan set, 6 months down the road.
Yeah.
And when it comes to ADA stalls, I know we've kind of talked a lot about that, but like what makes it different? Like what's, the sizing and all of that, and like what are some general rules of thumb for that?
Yeah. So the federal requirements of ADA require that ADA spaces need to be a minimum of 8 feet wide with a 5 foot access aisle for your standard vehicle. For van accessible vehicles, you need to provide a little bit of a larger space. They need to be 11 feet wide with a 5 foot access aisle. And this is because typically there's the sliding door on a van. People are getting on and off of their vehicle and with a ramp on the passenger side. So when you're designing the spaces, you always want to put the access aisle on the passenger side of the van parking space. Um, and as I mentioned before, there are some states that have additional requirements. Florida is one of them. They require all of their spaces to be a minimum of 12 feet wide with a 5 foot access aisle.
Okay. Wow, that's a pretty big stall.
Yeah, and they do their striping a little bit different in Florida too. You have to have um, some accent striping. So you have, instead of your one traditional stripe, you have two different stripes that are different colors.
Okay. I'm gonna have to look at that next time I'm in Florida. That's usually the last thing I'm looking for, but um, and then like you talked about the accessible path, so that's something that's separate from the stall itself, and that's getting you, the disabled person from the stall to the destination of where they're going, right? So that could be like the entrance to the convenience store or the grocery store, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the accessible path has a bunch of different components. The parking space is considered to be part of the accessible path just because you have that access aisle, and it's usually the first place that people with disabilities use once they get to a site. So within that, you can't have slopes that exceed 2% in any direction. And then along the route, once you leave that parking space, you enter a crosswalk or a sidewalk or whatever walking path you have that's designated. You can't have slopes that exceed 5% along the path of travel, and you can't have slopes that exceed 2% going across. Now, typically when we design, we don't design to the max. If we're in a parking space, we'll design around 1.5% to 1.75% if we have to, um, just because you want to allow for construction tolerances in the field.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Like 2% is like such a small margin. I feel like that itself is like you know, just like the tolerance. Because like I've seen so many times where like someone's out there with that ruler that has like the level on it going in every direction on your stall, and you're just like sitting there with your fingers crossed, like please have this construction contractor, the guy that was pouring the slab, good at his job, right?
Yeah, I've gone out on several sites and I've had to check the work done in the field, and more than once I've seen them have to rip it up one time and then sometimes a second time. The second time is usually rare, but it does happen the first time.
Yep, and I know on like a lot of retrofit projects for that grade, something that I've utilized is something called like a mill and overlay if it's asphalt. So it's like you take like a 2 inches kind of off like the top layer, and then they kind of pour like a slurry coat through it, and that kind of helps with that grading issue. Just because, especially if it's a retrofitted site, you're going into a parking lot that might have been built 20 years ago, it could look, you know, all over the place, and that's something that I've used, and it hasn't been too expensive to get that done.
Yeah, mill and overlay is definitely a good option to keep costs down. But obviously, if the slopes existing are pretty crazy, it's not something that is feasible to do if you need to lower your slopes by a lot to get into compliance.
Absolutely. And I think one thing too, when you're talking about EV charging, sometimes when you're building these large, you know, EV charging arrays, the question always comes up is like, what's technically the destination, right? Is it the charging station where that's where you want to be? Or is it also the convenience store, the shopping center, the park, or wherever you're technically at that's hosting this EV charging location? And you kind of get into this kind of gray area of like, where do I build the accessible stall to? Is it just to the public sidewalk? Is it to the store? Because like sometimes it could be very far away. Like where you're building your charging could be 300 feet from the entrance to the store or something. And you're kind of like, well, I'm just going to consider this the destination. So then I don't have my accessible path going a crazy length across a parking lot. Is that something that you've seen come up before?
Yeah, so with specifically with ADA parking and EV, what you're going to want to do is you want to make sure that you know the so the parking space is going to be your beginning point, and then
Hmm.
any feature that someone using an ADA space would want to use on site, you would also need to provide an accessible path to. Whether there's a park on site with a bench that these people may want to sit in, or a path to the convenience store, or if there's a pay booth on site, you're going to want to be able to provide an accessible path to all those features.
Got it. Okay. And when it comes to signage, I think most Americans at this point probably should be familiar with, just like the general handicap sign that's in a stall. It could be blue or yellow or teal. Um, but like I've seen before, it says like reserved, or it says like sometimes it's like used last. Can you kind of talk about some of the differences and kind of how those are used a little bit differently depending on the use case?
Yeah, so just like ADA spaces and their size and needing to refer to the local regulation, you're also going to need to refer to the local regulation for signage and use of these ADA EV spaces. Every Just about every state that I've worked in has a different requirement for ADA signage. Um, and then for EV, if the sign does say use last, and you are not someone with a handicap marker on your vehicle, then you can use it if it's last available. However, if it doesn't have use last on the signage, then you unfortunately are not able to use a space and you're just going to have to wait your turn.
Got it. And I think that's an important thing to call out that if it doesn't say use last, then the assumption is that it is a fully reserved stall for an individual that does have a handicap sticker for their vehicle. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. Because I think in the EV space, I've been to a lot of public chargers and stuff throughout the country going on road trips. And you do kind of get into some of those situations where I feel like, especially with crowded EV charging, as we're kind of getting more and more people buying EVs, you're going to come to this situation where I think you really have to look at that sign. And it's not always, you know, the bathroom etiquette where it's, use the handicap stall last, but it actually, you have to look at that sign so you make sure that you're following the local laws. And it is, as we talked about earlier in the show, just check with your local AHJ, check some of the local rules and reg. And then what I've even done sometimes, I just go on PlugShare or ChargeWare or some of these other sites, and I just kind of look at other permitted installations and I zoom into the sign and I see what they're using. That kind of gives me at least a little bit of an idea what's been built in the state. And I can kind of use that in conversations with the jurisdiction to kind of get to a point of like, what do we think is the right way to do it? Because in some cases, this could be the first time you're building EV charging in that county, and right, and you have to bring in other examples. But yeah, that reserve versus use last is definitely one of those gray areas that you always want to address early on.
100%.
Yep. And when it comes to, we talked about the sign, but what about like the logo? Is that something that it always has to have that logo? Because I've seen some EV charging locations where like it looks like it's an accessible stall, but it's not signed. It's like this just massive. It's like a 15-foot wide stall. I'm just not really sure. Is it always required, or does it depend?
They should always be there, just to help identify it um, as an ADA accessible space. And again, you're going to have to look at your local regulations to see, exactly what that logo is going to look like. Some of them you can just draw the standard person in a wheelchair. Others have like a different color background that you need to provide. And then, some states like the state of New York, they actually require an entirely different uh, ADA accessible logo.
Yep, I have noticed that where I've been in other states, I've noticed like slight differences in how those stalls are called out. And it's like obviously before being in the EV industry, I've never even looked at these stalls really or like paid much attention to it. Now I'm like laser focused anytime I'm in like a state I haven't spent much time in, looking at those stalls and see kind of how they're different, how they're signed different. It's actually pretty fascinating. Um, But I think another thing is about comments. So, you know, you've worked on a lot of these projects and stuff. Like, what are some of the most common comments that you get back from the jurisdictions on your plan sets regarding ADA?
And so, really, the most common comment that I see back from the jurisdictions is they either have questions on the grading or they want us to provide a lot more detail on the grading to prove that we are not exceeding the maximum required slopes. So that's the big one we see, and then other smaller ones are they just want us to tweak our signage details and stuff like that.
Yeah, I personally have seen a lot of stuff come by on that signage, and that's why I kind of always check early on, see what other folks are doing to kind of help you know get ahead of that comment. And to the point on the grading, is that something that you just have to do? We all have to do a better job calling out in your grading plan in your plan set, just to make sure that you're kind of calling out those tolerances in the notes very clearly.
Uh, yeah. So typically, you have notes on the side about ADA grading, saying you can't exceed these slopes. Um, you always want to have very detailed grading in areas that are going to be ADA features. And I found it's also nice to have like a pictorial image of what all these different features are going to be. So in the past, I've just had a sheet and it's a close up of the ADA route and ADA features, and I just put a different hatch for the different components of an accessible route, like the ADA parking space, the accessible path, the any ramps that are being proposed along the route, and any landings at entrances or tops and bottoms of ramps.
Oh, that's actually a good idea because usually in your demolition plan, you're just kind of showing like what you're trenching through and stuff, or asphalt versus concrete, but kind of adding that additional level of detail that calls out like how it refers to the grade that will have to be finished.
Exactly.
It's a good idea. Um, and when it comes to cable reach, I think this is something I think a lot of people forget about, but obviously with EV charging or other devices, right, you have to make sure that folks can reach and operate the piece of equipment that you're technically presenting to them. How have you kind of addressed that in your work? Yeah.
So the reach range for EV charging stations is between 15 and 48 inches front and side. And this will just allow someone who's in a wheelchair or maybe on crutches to reach all operable parts from the wheelchair. And the graphic I have up on the screen is from uh, uh, the U.S. Department of Energy.
Yep. And this stuff that I've been called out for in projects before is like making like basically being able to prove through like the manual from the EV charging OEM just to prove that like certain screens and things are in reach. And I think a lot of the EV charging OEMs are coming to America for like the federal NEVI program and stuff. That is one thing I think they're trying to figure out is because in Europe and other places in the world, it's not as big of a focus. And to really make sure that a lot of these things can be ADA compliant from a reach and visibility standpoint. So you're not having to like bring basically a charging pad down to grade or having to do curb cuts and all that stuff to accommodate the reach and the visibility to that person in a wheelchair or in crutches or in some other thing.
Yeah, exactly. You can design the parking space to be compliant from a grade standpoint, but that only does you so good if they can't get to the charger and actually reach it to use it.
Yep. And then kind of where do you see ADA kind of in the future? So like, how do you see it affecting projects? How do you see it kind of evolving to be kind of more inclusive and potentially having more material impact on projects?
Yeah, so ADA, it's always going to have an effect on EV projects because it's always going to impact your grading and your stormwater design, whether it's a retrofit or you're starting a new site from scratch. But the big thing is just to general awareness of the requirements for ADA. Make sure you know what they are before um, you start designing the project. Um, and just because there's been a surprising number of people who aren't aware of the ADA requirements and that the impacts that they have on their design.
Yeah. And I guess personally for you, you've spent a lot of time in your career working on ADA. Kind of like kind of what does that mean to you? And like, why do you have such like a big focus into it? Because like you're probably the number one person I ask every single ADA question I've ever had that's been like really odd or obscure, and you always have the answer.
Yeah, so the thing that I like the most about ADA, you know, you're really helping a lot of people and it makes you feel good about the work you're doing. Obviously, I've always enjoyed engineering, but I like it the most when I'm able to help people, access sites and access features that they wouldn't be able to if these regulations weren't in place.
Yep. And like I frankly couldn't agree more. It is kind of a pain sometimes in your projects. It can hold things up or it can completely wipe projects off the map from a retrofit standpoint. But at the end of the day, it's the absolute right thing to do. And it's that additional pain that I think that we have to deal with on a project is probably a fraction of what people that are actually in these situations have to experience. And if we're able to make their lives just a little bit better through this, I think it's all the worthwhile. That's kind of how I always look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I may as well design them now because at some point in my future, I'm probably going to be needing them too when I'm old and can't walk.
That is true. I haven't even thought of that before, but you're kind of actually building the infrastructure that you end up, you know, hey, we could all get into a car accident. We could all be put in an unfortunate situation, us or our loved ones. So, I think that's, it's definitely important. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think that's all we got for today. Eric Sandman, or I'm just gonna call you Sandman because that's what I've always called you. Thanks for joining. Definitely appreciate it. And to the viewers, if you guys have any questions or comments in this, I will leave Sandman's info in the comment section in the description below. Feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions. I think it's been a really cool episode. If you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe and let us know any of the feedback that you have. And until next time, this was CJ Berg with DevelopEV. Thank you all.